Yes, you can, Maarten.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first MVGM Residential Property Management webinar, which will be the first one in a whole series of webinars. Today we'll be speaking about residential property management. What does it bring in terms of value? What does it bring in terms of peace of mind? And what tools are required to deliver this service? And what is required today to have happy tenants? And we also look at what does the world of property management of tomorrow look like. And this will primarily focus on sustainability, community building, technology, and more services to make life more convenient. And what can a property manager like MVGM do to make this world, in that respect, just a little bit a better place? Now, we can all remember or relate to the moment you moved out of your parents' house. For me, it was when I went to study, and at first I lived with a couple of friends. And in all honesty, at that moment in time when you're a student, you don't really care about property management. You don't care if the dishwasher works or not, if there's cold water or not, because I think everybody can imagine as a student, you have a little bit different priorities. Going forward, in about 2004, I rented a house together with my wife, which was from a private investor. It was a nice and cozy apartment in the middle of Amsterdam, one-bedroom apartment with a small French balcony. So in reality, it's not really a balcony. And then going forward, my wife and I moved to another apartment in Amsterdam, which was slightly bigger because this was a two-bedroom apartment, because we were thinking about starting a family. So these are all big steps, and everybody can obviously relate to these type of changes in your life. Whether this is a young couple that's working double jobs to save up for a down payment on their first house but need to rent first, elderly that are in senior living, millennials that opt more for micro living, or students that go for student homes. For every individual here in this respect, this is a unique decision-making journey in renting your first house. So the second house me and my wife rented, that was owned by a big institutional investor. So we also had a property manager on it. And then you care about things in your house. You want it to be pleasant, effort needs to work. You pay quite a lot of rent, so you want things to be good. Everybody can remember that if you rent a house, that the CV is not working, you have cold water, the washing machine breaks down, dishwater breaks down, there's a leaking sink. All things that are giving some level of inconvenience, and ideally you want this repaired as soon as possible, and that's where a property manager comes in. And you can imagine when you have a lot of units under management, this is not an easy task to fulfill. So that also brings me to a big difference between commercial property management and residential property management, where residential property management is always, or very often, it's very personal. It's a home you live in, it's your house, and you want that to be working properly. And prioritizing things, keeping tenants happy, but also do the right reporting for the investors, make sure that they get the proper administration. All these different assets make property management for residential not a very easy task. Today we will be speaking about this from different perspectives. For one, we have seen that institutional and corporate investors have an increased focus on residential management. They also divert some of their strategies more into residential, and this is something that we see across Europe. Some investors have obviously already decades of experience with residential asset class, like CBRE Global Investors, and others are just starting. And therefore, I'm very pleased to announce our first speaker, which is Paul Oremus from CBRE Global Investors, who will share some insights on the importance of professional property management from an investor's perspective. Paul is Managing Director for Global Investors in the Netherlands, and he's also a member of the European Board since 2013. He's also the fund manager for the European Residential Impact Fund since its inception, and he's the fund manager for the Dutch Residential Fund since 2014. Paul's gone through a number of treasury functions, financial functions, and also CIO or CFO, COO functions before he moved into his current role. So I'm very delighted that Paul is willing and one of our speakers, because he has a tremendous amount of experience from an investor perspective. Going forward, that we will look at the elements and we'll give you insight on how property residential management increases value to assets. What can we do as a property manager? We show you some examples of how we work with and partner with investors and how we contribute to a higher return on your investment. In that perspective, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleagues, Cor Treure and Bas van Winden. Cor has more than 12 years of working at ING Real Estate, which converted later on to CBRE Global Investors in a number of roles. He started at MVGM in 2017, where he used his experience that he'd done from various funds to pay concept about sustainability, but also look at the end user, data exchange with property managers, to use that for the property management at MVGM. And currently, Cor is our Chief Information Officer for Europe. Bas van Winden, he has a background in residential. He's worked for over 10 years in that area. Most of the time with MVGM, purely in the property and asset management area. So Bas knows very well on a basic level how to operate residential properties, and also to look at to operate or to increase the operating income, and as said, increase value for investors, but also look at how can we create and get happy tenants. So jointly they will look at the operational side of the property management, and also look at the technology that is crucial for doing property management very well. My name is Maarten de Haas. I'm the Managing Director for MVGM Europe. I started at MVGM in January 2020. Before that, I worked at a competitor in a very similar role, where I was also part of their EMEA board, working out of the London office. And before that, I held various positions at Big Four organizations. All right, so enough about our speakers today. Welcome all again, and let's dive into some of the details. As said, during this webinar, we will look at property management from different aspects, but also look at it from different European countries. As MVGM, we are the only property management that is independent across Europe. It gives us a pan-European coverage. And also there, what we gear to is our two pillars of success, which is really about the people and the connection that we have with our investors, in combination with the systems that we have internally to do property management well. And we will look at that in more detail, obviously, later on. At the moment, we are active in 13 countries. In 10 countries, we operate through our own establishments, and we have in 3 countries partners firm arrangements and agreements, so also able to deliver their property management services. For global investors, CBRE Global Investors, they have either a wider span throughout Europe, leave alone they operate on a global level. So during this webinar, we will use all that knowledge, all the experience, the expertise that we have, the different views that we have from European countries, and use that to all transfer that to you, whereby we give you insight on the different elements. During this webinar, we will focus on a few specific points, which are the objectives and the goals of the webinar. So the first is why is residential asset class becoming more attractive to institutional and corporate investors. Then we'll have Paul being looking at the investors' perspective and why do they outsource property management activity, and what's the value that the property manager drives there. Bas will look at more the operational side and how can professional, well-organized property management contribute to a higher return. And finally, Cor will look at the technology side of things and how do we translate that into IT solutions, and also what is mandatory or really required to do this well in the changing needs and the changing future that we see for property management. As said on the initial homepage, there are some options to ask questions through the chat. We will pick up some of these questions at the end of the sessions. If not, then we will come back to you on a separate channel on that. All right, so let's quickly look at the first item. Why is residential property management becoming more attractive to investors? Maybe Bas, you can go one slide back. So why is it more important for residential investors? Well, one obviously is the return on investment that you get, but also the stability around it. For real estate investors, there's a choice between investing in commercial real estate, but also looking at residential real estate, and let's decide what's the better option, what's the better income option, maybe so to say. In general, we can say that the broad principle of asset selection, so as location, the property, the quality of the construction, the age of the property, the usage, etc., is fairly simple between residential and commercial properties. There are some difference, obviously, on the leasing period. It can be assumed that residential leasing is shorter across the whole line than commercial. Vacancy risk in residential might be a little bit higher, frequent turnover of tenants. So there are some qualitative aspects that we need to look at when looking at making investments. And that also translates into how we operate as property manager. There's a difference. The frequency that we need to interact with residential property management is different compared to how we interact with commercial property management. Also, our client, let's say the tenant, is different in this respect. So we have two clients, which are the tenants and the investors. So choosing between a commercial commercial real estate or a residential real estate investment is not an easy feat to tackle, because everybody of both series have their own sets of benefits, but also their own set of drawbacks. So why is there such an increased focus on the residential market at the moment? So besides return on investments, what we briefly touched upon just now, and the stability of that, essentially it's also due because two global economic and geographical movements. One is the rising population globally. At the moment, we are with 8 billion people on the globe, and that will grow to 9 billion in 2030. And that will grow to an estimated of 9.7 in 2050. So we see a humongous growth in our population that all need homes and houses to stay. And the second one important element is the millennial group, because that will become the world dominating power in terms of population, but also in buying power. At the moment, about 60 to 65% of the global wealth and income sits with baby boomers and their children, which is probably a big group of us. And this is drastically going to shift over the next 2-3 years, 2022, 2023, where millennials we become this large force of dominating the global wealth. And millennials just tend to be more flexible. They're not so connected to one house or particular location. They want to move around, whether this is within the city, whether this is within a country or cross-border. They don't have the real need to possess any material goods, which includes also real estate assets, as that might limit their freedom to move. So we see a huge shift there into renting houses instead of buying houses. So that's a gigantic force that really drives one of these elements on being more active on the residential front. And besides that, not to forget, the COVID-19 situation, the pandemic crisis, has also learned that investments in residential is a fairly stable investment, also during the crisis. So these are a couple of elements that we see why investors move more into the residential area, and their focus is maybe a bit less on the commercial investment area. So with that, that brings me to our next speaker, Paul Oremus, who will give you some insight, indeed, as we discussed, why do investors outsource property management, but also look more broadly at the community, sustainability, and some of these elements from an investor's perspective. Paul, can I hand over to you, please?
Yes, thank you, Maarten. Interesting to hear your story. We recognize the trends that you mentioned as an investor. Going to the next slide, what I would like to explain is a little bit what our organization is, what our vision is on property management, some small info about ESG, and finally a case study over a investment that we have made a few years ago, and where MVGM is the property manager. If we go to the next slide, CBRE Global Investors is part of CBRE, a worldwide real estate company. Global Investors is the investment platform. On a global level, we have over 100 billion of real estate investments. If you look to the EMEA platform, the size of that is 54 billion euros, which is a lot. We have 15 offices, come back to that later, and a team of over 500 people running the business. The focus of our company is more and more on real assets, which means that we're not only investing in real estate, like offices, retail, logistics, but also residential. Next to that, we have two other platforms investing in infrastructure, which is quite growing fast at this moment. And finally, a debt platform, which we acquired in the year 2019. If we look to our residential platform, which is on the next slide, we have a size in Europe over 8.8 billion euros, which is quite a lot. A very dominant position of our portfolio is in the Netherlands. By history, the Netherlands was one of the first countries in Europe which started investing in residential, which is quite a mature market at the moment. But the last couple of years, we also built up portfolios in other European countries. Some of those countries, MVGM is present as well. But the major countries in the field of residential are UK and Spain. And next to that, we're trying to grow in France, Germany, and Sweden, because we think those are mature countries which are quite interesting to invest as well. We have several funds running in Europe. On the next slide, we present the Dutch Residential Fund. I think this is the most mature fund in the company. Started already in 1970. That portfolio transferred into a fund late 90s, so we're now over 20 years of history. The Dutch Resi Fund has a dominance in the Netherlands, has a very good performance, and is growing quite fast. We have a pipeline at this moment in time of over 900 million euros, so we expect to grow in the coming 2 years to a value over 3 billion euros. On the next slide, you can see that we also have a new initiative in Europe. We have launched a pan-European residential impact fund. Come back to that word impact later on. But we fully agree with the trends which were explained by Maarten, that we see more and more urbanization across Europe. We see there's a tendency to rent, especially by millennials. And we see that the residential market is getting more and more important in the investment world. Last year, almost 1/3 of all real estate investments were made in the residential sector, and we expect that the residential sector will be 1/3 of all investments over Europe. At this moment in time, we're about 10 to 12%. So we expect a growth in the residential sector of over 20% in the coming years, which is a lot, I can tell you. Obviously, and I'm going to the item of today, modern property management. We immediately go to the next slide. We have a very strong vision of how that should be. Property management is important, will be more and more important, especially if you look to the residential products and the growth that we expect in the sector in the coming years. When I started my career, I think our relationship with property managers was really a client-contractor relationship. We were the client having a lot of demands and willing to pay the lowest prices as possible. I think many of our competitors are still doing that today, but we really are thinking today that we should take a different view in relation to our property managers. And therefore, and you can see that also on the slide, we think property managers are our partners. We expect responsibility, we expect ownership over our assets and our portfolios. And as an investor, we can't do that alone. The property manager is very important in that respect. Obviously, we have a lot of units in the Netherlands, only over 10,000, across Europe over 50,000. If we expect that our portfolios will triple in the coming years, we will have a residential portfolio over 150,000 units in 5 to 10 years time. And therefore, we need a partner which is capable of running such a portfolio. The question which was raised by Maarten before is why we outsource our property management. That's very good questions. You see different examples. Some of our competitors do property management by themselves. We do really think that you should be or should have a very dominant size. We don't think that the size in the Netherlands, but also in Europe, is big enough to have a very proper property management organization. Next to that, property management requires different skills compared to an investor. I really believe in focus. As an investor, we really believe in allocations and running a portfolio properly. But property management is really a different game, and therefore we are a true believer in outsourcing those activities. If you're looking forward, we really are focusing on innovation and technology, especially in the field of property management. Some examples we already developed the last couple of years with the help of MVGM. We think that data is getting more and more important, especially in the leasing field. Therefore, we have a partnership with Woof, also a company of MVGM, which helps us in the leasing of our assets. The funny thing of that is that using a digital platform also gives you a lot of information, and that information gives you also a lot of input over your tenants and the requirements that they have. That's the step, I think, to the second initiative, which is Watson Holmes. So I think we were one of the first investors which helped to develop the Watson Holmes platform. That gives us a true insight in our portfolios, but especially in our tenants and requirements that they have. But the platform also gives a lot of market updates. So in terms of rents, residential values, it's really a very important platform for us, which also helps us in making investment decisions. And that's really the step that we would like to make, not only property management, but also being part of our investment business and providing the data that we use or need to make the correct decisions. Obviously, and then we can go to the next slide, Bas, ESG is on top of our minds. I think 10 to 20 years ago, we were one of the first investors which started with ESG. Today, I think everybody is working on ESG, especially due to the Paris Agreement, which was signed a few years ago. We have seen that many of our clients do find ESG very important. And if you go to the next slide, I think we can see the past, but also the future. If you look at the right side of the slide, we really focus on E, environment, and on the left side of the slide, we come to the topic social. In terms of ESG, we have several initiatives, especially in the reduction of carbon emission, but also the usage of electricity and water. To do that, it is very important to also have the data in place, and therefore, again, we see a very important role of property managers. By knowing the usage of electricity, we can also make a calculation of the reduction that we make with our initiatives that we deploy in the last couple of years. But data is very important in that field, again, and that helps us to really find out which things we should do to come to a better level. A more difficult area is the social area. Therefore, we initially had a lot of focus on energy, but I think as from this year, the focus now also really on S. And social is, for me, all about tenant satisfaction. So everything comes together within the tenant satisfaction in our portfolios, and our goal obviously is to increase the tenant satisfaction over time. We do see that the tenant satisfaction is related to the quality of our assets. So the first thing we have to do is to increase that quality, but this also has to do with the services and the way our tenants are treated by property management. And finally, we see that communities and the contact with other tenants are important as well. So working on ESG, not only on the quality of our assets, but also building a high quality environment, including a community in which people find safety and connection to other tenants is very important. So we're really trying to have focus on that this year. And it will be very interesting to see how that will develop. Obviously, we have done a lot in the past. Therefore, I would like to go to our case study, which is Rhapsody. Probably we can put that on the slide. Rhapsody is a project in Amsterdam. We did a tender together with the developer, which is the NICE, which is also the construction company of this property. And we decided that this should be our showcase. And everything in the field of ESG should be included in this asset. Quite soon we found out that our property manager was really important in doing that. Therefore, we built the partnership with MVGM and try to embed many of our ideas and initiatives in this project. Many of our pilots projects were included in this property. The goals that we selected were low turnover rates, low lease times, and residents which should be ambassadors for our assets. And the principles that we started with were limited upfront investments. We are Dutch investors, so we don't like to spend money. Therefore, we decided to use pay-per-use. So there's a lot of services included in these assets. But tenants only have to pay for those services if they will use the services. And finally, we think it's very important that people and tenants have flexibility in this asset, and therefore we need partnerships, for example, our property management. A lot of stuff can be said about this asset. It has a very low efficiency rate. In Dutch terms, we use the EPC as a measurement guide. It has a negative score, which means that this property is generating energy instead of using energy, which is quite advanced. We have all other stuff included, like sharing amenities. You can see the greenhouse in the middle of the project. This can be used by our tenants. Meetings are organized by tenants in order to meet each other, but also to socialize. And we used some of the initiatives of the MVGM organization. For example, James, which is a manager which provides additional services to our tenants. And we have a company included which we call the Philly. So in the past, we were very negative about retail space in residential projects, but we found out that retail space can really support the environment of a residential property. The Philly is a more or less restaurant which can be used by our tenants, but there are many services which are included in that restaurant as well, and that's really an add-on on our projects. I think I have to stop my story. I could talk about a week about what we do and our relationship with property managers, and especially MVGM, but I think the time is a little bit too short, so I give the word back to Maarten.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. I would think I'll hand directly over to Bas. Also to look at a more property management angle on what we do on these type of assets that for example, the Rhapsody but also more broadly on the more basic operational elements to do property management for residential very well. Bas?
Thank you, Maarten. Thank you, Paul, for the outstanding presentation about your portfolio and the things that you want to achieve the coming years. I will go a little bit more into details in the day-to-day operations. We will start with this building because this is something where Paul already explained you something about. During this explanation, I will refer to IT tools and platforms. I will not go into the details of these tools and platforms. Cor will do this after me. I handed over the word to him as our next speaker. For a residential building, it is key to have general building information and detailed unit information before you start to operate the project. So before we start the leasing and to operate the project, we are already in close contact with, in this case, CBRE Global Investors to get all the information which is needed and to implement it in our system. With the information, we can generate basically the building into our system. And after that, we can start the leasing process. It's very important. I will say it more times, but it's very important that you implement it before you start, because with residential you have a lot of units, a lot of tenants with a lot of questions. So then the basis of your administration is key to have a good management. If we talk about a new building, we can already start the leasing during the construction time. Like Paul said, this is very important, and we also believe that this will contribute to higher revenues after the construction is finished during the first years. Throughout Europe, we see different approaches. Not in every country it's normal to do this. But in the Netherlands, where the supply is or the demand is much more than the demand, it is possible to do it. After we completed the building administration, like I said, we can implement and start with the digital leasing process. For this project, we did everything digital. Why we did it is because we need to start during the construction period. And what is important with residential building is to understand who is renting your property. So if we do it in a digital way with our IT system, we can gather all the information from our potential tenant. And we can go into the process with them, but we can also adapt our marketing strategy if we see that our target group is a little bit different than expected, for example. So that's why the digital way of leasing is helping us during the leasing of the project. Another important thing is your potential tenant who they say they are, and is the potential tenant able to pay the rent. This is of course important for you as a landlord, but also for your tenant. Sometimes tenants, especially when it's their first home, like Maarten said in the beginning, tenants are not aware what they can pay. And I believe it's also a responsibility from the landlord and the property manager to help the tenant during this process. Included in the digital leasing process is attention to potential housing fraud. This is something which is quite common in the Netherlands, but we also see in other countries, for example, with criminal organizations. Important to have attention to the sustainable income for the tenant and to keep your vacancy as low as possible. After we go into the credibility check with the tenants, we need, of course, to sign the contract as well. Also, this can be done digital, and where we have a lot of millennials as tenants, they are also interested to do this because during the daytime they are busy with their jobs and other things to do. So then at the night they can sign the contract whenever it suits them. But there are also always tenants who prefer to do this face-to-face, and this is also nice to do, of course, because you can make someone happy with a new home. After the leasing process, it's again important to process your information of the approved tenants and the signed leasing contracts into your system in connection with the rented unit and the detailed information about the unit as mentioned earlier. What is important to note here is that our tenants are private persons in perspective to commercial real estate, where you talk with companies. And we need to apply with the privacy protection regulations which are applied locally. This is something that's very important, especially when you are doing your processes as digital as possible, because you have all the data of the people, the private persons in your system. And for the ones who are starting just with the business or thinking about to outsource the property management or do it by themselves, this is, I think, a point of attention for everyone. After the construction period and the leasing, we start the regular property management, and based on the target group of the project, we decide how to serve the tenant. Across Europe, we see the majority of tenants prefer digital communications, which is easier to manage for us as a property manager if you have the right software tools. But the risk regarding privacy protection, for example, is bigger. For the ones who don't have experience with residential yet, I also would like to attend some other things. Sorry, this needs your attention. And some other services that you, for example, can provide to your tenant, but that is based on the target group, is what we did here is a shared electrical car service, so that you have to have less parking spaces on your property, and the tenants can use it whenever they want, and they pay per use, like Paul said. We can also deliver dry cleaning, for example, and there is an on-site hospitality and community manager to support tenants with parcels when they are at the office, for example, or to water their plants when they are on holiday. Well, this is my, I'm already started, but this is my official introduction slide. Furthermore, I will show you how professional property management will contribute to a higher return on your investment, and explain the difference between residential and commercial property management. Again, I will refer to some IT tools or platforms, and Cor will explain this after I handed over the word to him as the next speaker. Please note that I will talk in general and about the majority what we see across Europe during this explanation. Each target group, each building, each area and each investment strategy has their own ways how to approach and organize the property management, of course. How I think an important question for all of us and very relevant is how to optimize the return on your investment. This can be by direct revenues and costs, but also on the long term, the value of your property. Why it is important to have all this tenant information, the systems, and all the data is to have to get the data and to see if the services that we provide to the tenant, if they are using it, and if they use it, how they rate the service. Because if this is good, then we can spend more on this. But if it's not good, then of course it's better to delete the service and maybe to implement another service, so that will lower your costs again. And with implementing a new service, the tenant will be more satisfied. So that you also can control your costs and have happier tenants. And this is an ongoing process because tenants and buildings and environment are changing. Tenants from residential units are private persons, and I think, as you all know, you are also on social media. You are seeing the news daily, and when you see something new or interested in servicing, you also would like to have that service. So we need to adapt that during the property management, to implement this in our property management. In the figure on the left side, you see in headlines how this process works. In reality, of course, this is much more detailed, but for this webinar, I think the base is good to understand. With good IT tools, you will put out a lot of data out of this process. Based on this information, you can service your tenant and service your tenant as good as possible. And the expenses which not satisfy your tenant needs to be excluded. Oh, sorry, went wrong. Something wrong with my slide. are willing to pay, happy tenants are willing to pay more rent if the building and the service fulfill their needs. We also see that happy tenants are taking care of his apartment and will stay longer in the apartment. So it will not only increase your revenues on the rental pricing, also lower your vacancy, because you can have a good marketing of your property if you have a stable data. But also your daily maintenance cost and your rotation maintenance cost will decrease because the happy tenant will handle the apartment like it's their own, if they are happy with the service and the apartment. If it's not what they expect or something else, we see they will leave maybe after 2 or 3 years, but also they will not do any maintenance on the apartment. So that will increase. I think this, in a nutshell, the answer to the question how to increase the return on your investment. If we talk about the net operating income, of course, this is very in a nutshell, and there are much more details that affect this, but it's related to the story that I explained. And on the long term, this will increase the value of the property as well. So I think this is something that's always good for an investor. If we look at the differences between residential and commercial property management, I've highlighted some service focuses and where I will explain the differences between both. For example, the leasing management, the biggest difference is the volume. You have a lot of units. For example, in the building of Rhapsody, we have over 230 units, I believe 239. And also registrations, because in Amsterdam, it's in Amsterdam, and like Paul said, we are also aiming on the mid-rent. So a lot of people are interested in this in the units. And when a unit is coming on the market, you see sometimes that over 100 people react on that unit. And I believe that's a big difference with commercial real estate. And you not only need to service your chosen tenant, but of course also the 99 ones that you will reject for this unit, because they will ever come back to you for a new opportunity. The customer service for the tenant is different, I believe. You are in touch with a private individual. That's different if you compare it with a company, for example, in a commercial real estate. And what is very important is the 24/7 availability to the tenants, because there can be a fire during the night time or something else happen, and yeah, we must be ready. Of course, they need to call the fireman, but also us as a property manager to keep the damage as low as possible, and also to solve the problems during the next day. So I think that's something that you also see in commercial real estate, but especially when you are handling with private individuals, it's necessary. The personal involvement of a tenant, I believe, is different. Someone is living in your building. A lot of people spend a lot of times in their homes, and they want to be happy when they are at home. So it's not only about the property that we deliver and the service, but also do they feel at home is really important. And what we see across Europe in the private rent sector is that 20 to 35% of the gross annual income, whether it is a single tenant or a family, is spent on rent. So a big part of the income is spent on rent. And that's why tenants are also, it's understandable that tenants are expecting a good service and a good property. If we look at data and reporting, it can be a little bit the same, but there are also differences. And again, I want to notice the big difference in volume, the number of leasing agreements, and the number of units in your building. And this data is needed to improve your service and your service processes to the tenants. Cost-effective technical management, I believe, is also quite the same, the basis. But the biggest difference with residential and commercial real estate is that you need to access the unit. So if you have a retail unit or an office and you go there during the daytime as a supplier or a vendor, then you can always enter the building. But with the residential units, a lot of people are working during the daytime. So also to make an appointment with them and to fulfill their needs, you need different types of suppliers, and you need to facilitate the tenant with making an appointment to solve the problem when it suits them. And I believe the knowledge of the tenant, sometimes with retail or office or another commercial asset class, is also not very well. But when you talk about a private individual renter, then you see that the knowledge is very, very low. And we need to guide the people to see what is the problem when they are calling us or they are approaching us in a different way. We need to guide them to see what is the problem and immediately understand, okay, then we need to send this a supplier with this equipment so that they can solve the problem in one time. This will of course have a happy tenant, but also lower your cost than if the supplier needs to go there 2 or 3 times to check what is the problem, and they need to make an appointment again with the tenant, and then they get the right equipment, and then they come back to solve the problem. If you look at laws and regulations, this is something also Paul already pointed out a little bit, especially in the Netherlands, but also in other countries in Europe. Housing is on top of the political agenda, and that's also why laws and regulations are changing fast, and this is very important to implement this into your system, especially when you have a portfolio of above 1,000 units, for example. Yeah, you can imagine what a lot of administrative work it will be if there will be a change in laws and regulations, and I believe that these changes are much more and faster happening in residential real estate than in other asset classes. The robust financial management is again the same as reporting. It goes about the big volume, and it's very important to have a good IT system. And that's why I will hand over the word now to Cor. He will go more into the IT tools that we have, and also in how it works.
Thank you, Bas, for an introduction. Yes, a lot of things are already mentioned, but one thing I want to focus on, and that's the end user. So, Bas, will you please show the next slide? The end user, what's going on? The world is changing. End user, more people want to have their personal devices, want to have all information in one hand, but not only in one hand with different apps, with different entries, but also, if possible, one entry for all information related to your property or related to your unit. And that's what we as a property manager has to handle with, and not only related to the end user, but also in a community. A community is a part of a property environment, and if you stay in a good community, you will also stay longer at your unit, and that's good for the landlord, and that's good also for us as a property manager. And this is why IT becomes more and more important. We can facilitate the end user and the community with all kinds of information, with all kinds of services, what's relevant for them, but they have to select what's relevant. Because if they get all kind of information, push them from different vendors or from us, it looks like spam, and that's what we don't want. They as an end user want to select what kind of information is relevant for me and what kind of information is for me to notice on. And what I already said, it's not only unit, it's also related to the community. It's related to around a property, and where we as a property manager has to deliver that kind of information in a good but also a secured way. That means if you leave a unit because you end your lease agreement, you also must be signed off. So it's not only presenting, but it's also aftercare. If you are leaving or if you have changes, we need an information system that can facilitate the end user, but also the landlord related to all kinds of changes in the environment. And what we see is that life is more and more integrated in work and life can be done everywhere. So all kinds of services related to, for example, Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi, it must be organized inside such property, and it must be a service for a good property manager at a high-end property of residential units. I think this is why we should facilitate landlords, but at the end users with good information. Next slide, Bas, please. Because the information who an end user received give them also the possibility to build a picture, to build what kind of information, what kind of property manager, what kind of landlord I belongs to, and that gives us the world of ratings, like Airbnb or Booking.com. We as a property manager have different kind of activities where the end user can give us ratings, social ratings. And if you live in a residential property with a lot of units with a high rating, it gives us a better relet position than if it is a low rating. And that's also what related to the services, and also related to what kind of environment for sport activities and so on are available for such a property. So we as a property manager has to react with all kinds of ratings, and ratings brings us also the need to give a good presentation of an apartment during your customer journey. It's matching of candidates. Bas already mentioned, if you have one vacancy, one unit vacancy, then are 100 people who want to rent that environment, to rent that unit. You will also have to pay attention to the 99 because they are in the future a new customer for us. But during that environment, we also need to facilitate the end user by digital services, signing, identity check, but also the introduction to the new community. So if you become a new tenant of a unit, but also has a community, we as a property manager must introduce that unit to that tenant to the new community. Beside this customer journey, we also have to manage the debtors. We have to manage all service cost consolidations and so on. And it's only possible if we use process management. So if we want to give attention to the end user, a lot of processes, a lot of activities who can be automated must be done automated. And that's why we also pay attention to process management in our IT environment. But on the other hand, we are not only servicing the end user, we are also servicing, for example, a landlord. We give them information for wholesale scenarios. We give contractors information about their service level agreement, what they are doing for us in such a property manager. We are also delivering information to the end users related to maintenance plans. So all kinds of such information we have to manage as a residential property manager. And that must be based on one source. That must be based on one data source. We as a property manager, we are the touch points of the tenant, but on the other hand, we are also the information supplier for an investor related to their wholesale analysis. Next slide, Bas, please. One of the big differences between commercial and residential property management activities is the personal touch. We as a property manager in the residential market has a direct contract with the real end user. And we have different kind of contacts, we have different kind of channels who have been managed by us, must be managed by us, related also on the same data source. Because as you have an end user, he is calling, he can also use his app for access to the data. He can using a video call, he can using the web portal for access that data, and that data must be consistent. The data must be one truth. Otherwise, you have big problems. If you look to the property manager for residential, we are sometimes also manage like call center. It is not a call center for cold calling. It's a call center for a warm welcome for all kinds of questions. But we are preferable use the digital way, apps, video calls, or self-service portals, and so on. 24/7, it must be available, and that's the difference between the residential side and the commercial side. I already mentioned that there are must be one big truth, one big database, and that's next slide please, Bas. That's why we create the platform. It's a software platform where all kinds of property management activities are available, and they are integrated. And what does it mean integrated? It's integrated with all kinds of actors in the real estate supply chain. So not only the end user, not only a technical manager or a account manager, but sometimes also the asset manager of a landlord who has access and who can have approval possibilities. It's one source and one truth of information. It's device independent and also secured, because we are talking with end users about the private data, but also we have to be aware that they're using different entries. It's their PC, it's their app, it's their and so on. So we have to manage it in one integrated solution. If you look to that if you look at integration, it's also mentioned that there is a document management system in it. So the signed lease contract is available for us, but also available for the end user. So he can look, what's my rent last year, or what's the service cost, or what, and so on. So we have one single entry for all kinds of information, but also related to, for example, a contractor, a subcontractor. If there's a change in the elevator, the information must be stored in this platform. The technical manager can see, but also the end user can see, coming week, the elevator, there is a maintenance activity. So a lot of things must be integrated in one platform. And that's not only between persons, individuals, but also sometimes between a property and a person by themselves. For example, a smart building, if there is a possibility to store your energy consumption, so how many electricity do you use at that unit, it will be automatically uploaded in this platform and also available for all kinds of actors. Now I will show you some slides, 2 slides related to the end user. This is the end user as a tenant. You see there is a local rental platform. In this case, it's a lookalike for Spain, but sometimes we have also the possibility to create, it related to property. So Rhapsody has their own label, has their own identity. And then you have a connection between the physical property and the virtual property on the internet. That's why we also generate such a platform where a lookalike and a label and identity possibilities are available. Then you have the tenant portal in the middle. You have the possibilities as a tenant to look direct in your document, but also do a drill down to the service cost invoice related to, for example, the elevator or other maintenance plans. And on the other hand, we have the Tenant App. And the Tenant App is related to all kinds of information for you as a unit, but also integrated with the community environment. So if you need, for example, a bike and you are not owning a bike, you can ask in your community, whose bike is available so I can go to the city. That's part of that one tenant app, and it's one information entry to all kind of sources. And then the next step, we have also end user tool for the landlords. And in the right side, it's based on the same truth. It's based on the same platform, but consolidated. What's going on in the property, or what's going on in that administration, or what's going on that set of properties. The landlord or the asset manager had direct access. And on the other hand, the left hand, we have also possibilities to facilitate landlords with advice how to rebuild or how to re-identify or relabel properties when they want to be refurbished. This is what we call additional property management activities, in this case done by Watson & Holmes, a company of MVGM, and gives the other people more and more comfort to help. Give the asset manager to help to make the best selection for that location and for that best target group, the end user target group, who give us at the end, I hope, the best ratings for this location, but also for the property manager. I think, yes, I want to hand over it to Maarten. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cor. Thank you very much, Bas, as well. So going this through this webinar, we can say, yes, that was quite a lot of information coming towards the audience, I guess. And it defines also what I said in the beginning. Property management of residential is not an easy task. There's a more demand coming from both clients, investors, but as well as tenants. They're playing a more dominant role in the cycle of their property management. So looking at the objectives of the webinar, we looked at the residential asset class and why is this becoming more important to corporate institutional investors. Paul spoke about the residential property management, but a little bit broader. I think one of key elements that Paul also mentioned is the usage of the property and really work towards tenants being your ambassador. That's probably the best you can get to. And if you look at for the example, the Redfleet project that CBRE Global Investor does, I think that's an excellent example of how the future would look like. He spoke about low turnover in terms of tenants, really partner with the property manager to make sure that this type of projects really work. And he also emphasized again the focus on economic well-being, social responsibility, sustainability in terms of how they do the community building. Bas spoke about the operational elements and how can I contribute to your investment. As I said, we looked at the case study, the Rhapsody building. Bas also spoke, I think what's important is make sure you get a property management company involved as quickly as possible. If you're under construction, it really makes sense to have a property management on board really quickly because those type of companies like MVGM, we can really transfer our knowledge and look at what are the best ways to attract tenants to make sure you get it filled as soon as possible. And we also spoke about the more digital area around the leasing process and how that would work with tenants of today. Because you see a shift from let's say the more elderly people, let's put it like that, towards millennials. They want much more digital. And Cor last spoke about the IT solutions that you need to have for property management and to do that well. We looked briefly at the customer journey. We looked at process management, how we do that as MVGM with an integrated platform. The service focus, I think that comes across in all the three people that they spoke about. But also the touch point of the end user, work through apps, building apps, getting connected to the building even for tenants. These are all developments that look more into the future and how that would be. So finally, I would like to close off by thanking our speakers very much, Cor and Bas as my colleagues, and specifically Paul. Thank you very much for your contribution, also from an investor perspective. I think it was very valuable to also have that input and really see and get from your perspective how you partner with property managers to really drive the value in your assets, and how we as MVGM obviously are very aligned to that, as we believe in the same philosophy of working together. All right, I thank everybody in the audience very much for your attention. Our contact details are here. Any questions relating to property management, you can go to the people with the blue circle around them. Anything more relating on an investment perspective, I think Paul and Global Investors really lead the pack with investing in residential real estate. Our contact details are here. Feel free to contact either one of them if you have any more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maarten.